In this video, we're going to take a look at using a user input for degrees. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to talk about using the user input and inputting degrees. So at the end of the last video, we were working on our add-in for allowing the user to input some values and create a user parameter. So if we edit this, then where we left off was setting some defaults, 5 millimeters and diameter as the default input name. We asked for user input for the name of the parameter as well as the value. And then we called our units manager. We used the units manager to evaluate the expression. And then we converted it. We used the create by real to turn that into a value that we could use in the user parameters add. So through all this process, at the end of the last video, I mentioned, well, this is really looking at a length value, not degrees, which we have to account for. And we did a quick test to see if we could get it to work, and it didn't. And I did a little bit of playing around, and essentially what I did was I forgot to convert or to change some of these values. So what I want to do in this video is I want to repeat this process, or I want to make some modifications to what we have here, and talk about how we can incorporate another unit. So basically, when we look at the input box, we're asking the user for a string. So this value is going to come in, and then we need to do something with it. So Fusion 360 doesn't care in the string if we say 5 millimeters or 5 degrees. It's still going to sort of go through and parse it out. But what we have to be mindful of is the fact that this evaluate by expression is looking for the expression as a string and the units as a string, and the conversion will happen to a float. Now this is important because what ends up happening is this evaluate expression automatically goes through the process of helping us deal with the default units in Fusion 360, which again are centimeters for our length values and radians for our angles. So this units value is what we really need to create as a degree. So we don't lose any of our work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a copy of this line. So I'm going to take this entire line and I'm going to copy it and paste it down one row. Then I'm going to comment this one out so we still have it. And I'm going to do the same thing with this line for our user parameter. I'm going to copy it. Let's go ahead and copy it and paste it below. Keeping in mind that Python is really specific about things like indents, this is going to be important. So we do need to make sure when we paste it that it is still in the correct order or correct line. So now what we need to think about is when we're asking the user for a value, in this case, we're just asking for a generic user parameter. But we need to be extremely mindful unless we build in some logic that says, you know, if they enter a degree, this is what we want. If they enter a length, this is what we want. So we're not going to get deep in, we're not going to go down that path of really doing a lot of handling of what's coming in. We're just looking at the different ways in which we can handle it. So the main thing, or the first thing really, is that we need to take a look at this evaluate expression. And remember that it's looking for the expression as a string, which we already have, and then the units. And the units are important because that's what we're converting here. So instead of using the default units, there are other units that we can use. So for example, there are internal units, but part of the problem with this is that the internal units aren't really going to handle the degrees, and this property usually uses the convert rather than evaluate expression. So for us to manually handle this, what I'm going to do is put my quotations in here, and I'm going to say DEG for degrees. What I'm doing is I'm saying this is the expression, I'm asking for a degree value, and this is the unit system that I'm working in. So that should take care of the input and everything with evaluate expression. But the last piece of that puzzle is the units that we're sending to our user parameter. So right now what we're doing is we're sending the units manager default length units, which again is going to be millimeters for most designs. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put in quotes and we're going to say DEG for degrees. So now what we're doing is instead of using the default length units, we're saying specifically we want degrees. Now, instead of saying the default length units for our user parameter, we're saying degrees. That's what we want. So instead of 5 millimeters up here, I'm just going to say 5 DEG for degree. And then I'm going to save this and we're going to run it and see if it works. So back in Fusion 360, this is a new untitled document. So inside of here, you can see that I have draft 5 degrees, and I'm going to delete that and make sure that there's nothing in there. So utilities, going to go to my add-ins and API user create. So we're going to run this. And instead of diameter, we'll change this to draft. We'll say OK. And you can see the default value is 5 degrees. I'm going to change it to a larger value. Doesn't really matter. 15. And our message box pops up, says success. So now we go back and we check. We should have draft. The unit is degree and the expression is 15. That's just what we put in. So now we can see that based on some of the code, we can easily handle draft. But we have to be careful because it's working specifically with the units in our evaluate expression, and it's working with our units directly in the user parameters. So what happens if we try to toss another unit at this? So let's just see. I'm pretty sure it's going to fail, but let's give it a shot and just see what happens. So diameter, it's a different name, so it's going to add a different parameter. And instead of degrees, if I say millimeters, you see that we get an issue. And that's because millimeters, even though we're passing it as a string, is getting parsed out with that units manager. It's looking for the value of the units and it's failing. So if we try this again, and we'll just use diameter as the example, and instead of degrees, we're not going to put anything there, and we say okay, it works fine. So back in our modify and change parameters, you can see we added diameter and it's 5 degrees. So there is going to be a limit here. We need to deal with the arguments and we need to deal with the user input. And in most cases, you'll find when Fusion 360 is asking for a value, they're asking for enter a diameter or enter a length or enter a draft angle or a taper angle. There's not really a case where you can enter an angle or a length value. That's not something that you typically would come across. So when we ask the user for input, then we need to consider these things. Now keep in mind that this user input, there is this default value, which is what we're pulling in. But remember that this is a tuple. It's passing back a string and the Boolean. We can do some work with the units manager and we can check if the units are valid. So if this is something that you want to continue to pursue, you can carry on going through the units manager property and you can see all the different calls or modules or functions that we can pull up. And then you can find out if one of those is going to help you do the conversion. But we're not going to go down that for this example. It's just going to get a little bit too detailed. What I want to do now is I want to create essentially our final script. The original intent of the script was for us to build one that creates our user parameters for all the things that we need for a default design. So we're not going to be looking at user input anymore. We're not going to be worrying about evaluating the expression. We're going to do some hard coding. But we want to create a new program. So I'm just going to copy what we have here all the way up to design. I'm just going to Control C. I'm going to go back into Fusion, back to my scripts, and I want to create a new one. So we're going to create a new one using Python. This new script, again, I'm going to say API just so it's at the top of my list. We can change these names later if we want. So we're going to call this API create draft template. So with this new one, create draft template, we're going to begin editing. And of course, trust the author. And this is where we're starting. Now, remember, we already copied everything, so we should be able to just paste it in here. So we're bringing our design, we are bringing our default inputs, and then we kind of still have all this user input stuff. We're not going to worry about user input or the units manager or any of the other stuff that we had to do here, with the exception of this value input create by real. That's still going to be important to us. We're still going to need it. Then we want to make sure that we do keep the add parameters, and we're going to repeat this process a couple times. So I'm going to leave it for now. I'm going to just comment some of these things out. We don't need the units manager. We don't need to evaluate our expression, but we will need the create by real, and we will need the user parameters bit here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and I'm going to put it up here. And I'm going to copy this one, the create by real, and I'm going to put it up here as well. And these are going to be the little bits of code that we're starting with. And then down here, again, for right now, I'm going to get rid of this stuff, but for right now, I'm just going to leave it so we have it as a reference. So we need to begin thinking about the values that we want to control in a template. So we're going to have things like input names. We're going to have input values. We're not going to have any comments, so really I'm going to focus on three main things. I'm going to focus on wall thickness, I'm going to focus on internal wall thickness, and we're going to focus on draft angle. Of course, you can create as many as you want, but those are going to be the three main values that I'm going to focus on. And because we're hard coding this, we could simply put them directly inside of our inputs, but it's going to be a little bit easier if we come to edit this to just put them all at the top. So instead of default input number, what we're going to do is I'm going to call this one draft angle, and then I'm going to call this draft, draft name. So this one's going to be called draft, that's going to be that. And the draft angle, we're just going to simply set to the number 5. Now remember what we're doing here, actually, you know what, let's set it to the number 2. What we're doing here is we are going to pass these variables through all of our code, and we don't need to worry about passing things like the DEG part of degree because it's going to be hard coded inside of here. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create the parameter for thickness. So we're going to call this one thickness value, and the thickness value, we're going to assume we're dealing with a metric file, so we're going to have 2. And then we're going to have thickness name. And again, this is going to be a string. So we're going to call this one wall thickness. Remember, we can use an underscore, but we can't have space in here, even though we can directly in Python. We can't when we pass it to the user parameter. It won't allow it to have a space, so then it'll throw an error. So that's our second parameter. Then we're going to have another one that's called internal wall thickness, and this internal wall thickness is a value. So I'm not going to add the value part on there because it just makes it too long. But this internal wall thickness is going to be our wall thickness value, or the thickness value, times a certain modifier. So I'm going to say my thickness value, and we're going to multiply that times 0.6. And then the last thing we're going to need is that internal wall name. So internal wall T, and I'm going to just do name for that. And this is going to be internal wall thickness. So we have our strings and we have our numerical inputs for all the things we need. You can see here thickness value says it's being used because we referenced it here, but all the rest of them are still gray. Now what we need to do is we need to actually pass these through this real input. We need to create by real. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it a handful of times. So I'm going to just paste it 3 times, and I'm going to do the same thing with the user parameters. So I'm going to copy that, I'm going to go down a line, and so on. Now obviously they're exactly the same right now, so we need to adjust this a little bit. And remember, this doesn't really have to do anything with these strings. We only have to worry about the actual numerical values. Those are going to be important. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do real draft. So I'll just call that real draft. And this is going to be create by real from my draft angle. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to say real thickness. And that's going to be taking its input directly from our thickness value. So I start typing that, and I can just hit tab to accept it. And then the last one here is going to be real, and we're going to call this wall t, real wall t for wall thickness. And again, this is going to be pulling it from internal, and that's going to be the internal wall thickness. So at this stage, you can see now that what we're doing is we're pulling in some values. We didn't use internal wall name, and we didn't use the draft name or the thickness name, but we have pulled in these three numerical values. The next thing that we want to do is we want to take care of that down here where we're adding our actual parameters. So right now what we're doing is we have this new name input with the tuple, and that's because that's what was left over from our old code. But now we're not asking the user for input. We are directly adding it. Now, if you remember, as soon as we type add and we put the brackets, we get this tooltip that's telling us exactly what it's looking for. The name is a string, the value input, or the value is our value input, the units are a string, and then the comment is just empty if we want it to, or we can add something. And the return is the user parameter, which we're not actually returning it into anything. We don't have a value of a variable that equals this, so we're not passing anything back. And that's okay because we don't need to right now. But we do need to change these new inputs. So the first one that we want is going to be our thickness or our drafting, whichever we want to display first, we can add that one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll just start in the order we typed them in. So we're going to do draft name. So draft, and we're going to pick draft name. So that's our string we're passing. Next, we need to pass in the input value, and that's going to be that create by real. So this is going to be my real draft. And then the angle is going to be degrees, and the comment is going to be empty. Then the next one we're going to do is this is going to be our thickness. So we're going to do the thickness name. I'll just start typing that. Again, tab to accept that from our list. The thickness value, again, this is the one we're passing through the value input create by real. So this is real thickness. And this one is not degrees. This one is going to be millimeters because we're dealing with a metric design. Then the last one here, this is going to be that internal wall thickness. So I'll start typing that. Internal wall t name. And then the actual value for that is going to be the real wall t. And again, the units are millimeters. So now we theoretically have everything we need. We don't really need any of this stuff, so I'm gonna just clear it out of here just to make a little space. And what we should see is that when we run this, if we did everything right, when we run this, let's go ahead and save it, it should create 3 different user parameters in our design. So let's go back to Fusion. Inside of this design, there's already a couple user parameters, so I'm just going to clear them out. I'll delete those. So now it's empty. Utilities, add-ins. This one is going to be our create draft template, and we'll run it. It says success. We didn't get any error messages, so this is good. We go back to our change parameters, and now we have draft, wall thickness, and internal wall. But you'll notice that we've got some issues. These values are nowhere near correct. So even though we passed degrees, we didn't actually get degrees back out. So we passed it degrees, but now we've got essentially radians stored as a degree. We didn't get our metric values that we put in. They should have been 2 millimeters, and then it should have been 2 millimeters times 0.6. So instead of getting 2 and 1.2, we got 20 and 12. So even though we gave it the values that we were hoping for, we ended up not actually getting everything we needed in our conversion. So if we do Control Z to bring back all the stuff I deleted, we have the information down here about the user input. We have the information about evaluate expression, and using this in the units manager is what'll help us convert radians to degrees, and it'll help us convert centimeters to millimeters. So even though it seemed like a pretty straightforward process, we are going to end up having to bring some of this in. But the good news is we've already captured this data. It's already in our code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this units manager, and I'm going to put it up here before we do the real value input. So I'm going to just simply stick it here. Again, we need to make sure that our tabs and our indents are okay. Units manager is now in there. And now what we want to do is we want to pass these values into the units manager before we do the real value input. So the units manager part is going to sort of prep these values, and then the value input create by real is going to sort of process them so that it'll work inside of our user parameter add. So the way that we're going to make this work is we need to add the code for each of the values that we need to convert. So the draft angle, what we're going to do is we're going to say draft angle real, and we're going to say that this is equal to our units manager dot evaluate expression. And then inside of here, remember we need our expression as a string and our units will be a string. So here's the tricky part is we pass those variables as actual numbers, and we kind of needed to pass them as actual numbers so our thickness value could multiply by 0.6. We wouldn't be able to do that if we pass them as strings. But what we can do here is we can use that internal code in Python, str, to convert it to a string. We'll put some additional brackets and we'll type in draft angle. So now what we did was we took the actual number 2 and we converted it to a string directly in here. Then what we're going to do is put a comma, and we need to tell it what units we want. So in quotes, we're going to say DEG. And this is going to give us the draft angle real. And then what we're going to end up doing is instead of passing draft angle into create by real, we're just going to add real to the end of it. Then up here, the next thing that we want to do is we want to take that thickness value. So thickness value, I'm going to hit tab, but then I'm going to add real to it because again, we need to sort of translate these things. So the names are getting a little bit complicated, but again, we need to process them so that they will work in our units. So we're going to do the units manager again, dot evaluate expression. And again, we need to convert it to a string. So str brackets. And for this one, we're bringing in the thickness value. Then this is not going to be degrees, it's going to be millimeters. And then once again, we want to come down here to thickness value and just add real to the end of it. Then we're going to do this one more time, and this time it'll be the internal wall thickness. So we're going to do internal wall thickness, and we're going to add real to the end. Then we're going to go to units manager dot evaluate expression, convert it to a string, and this is going to be our internal wall thickness. We're going to do a comma, and again, this is going to be millimeters. Now we need to come down to our create by real, and we're just going to add real to the end of it because now instead of passing this original value, what we're doing is we're passing the value from the evaluate expression. So we basically took values as numbers, we converted them to strings because we wanted to have this conversion here. We could have simply put in a 1.2 as a string or this value as a string and it would have worked. So now these draft angle real, thickness value real, all those are still fine. We didn't change the rest of this. So theoretically, this should now work. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. So back in Fusion, we want to go back to our parameters. Remember, we haven't done any error handling, so we're going to get rid of those values, those parameters, so we don't throw any errors. And then we're going to run this again. Create draft template. Now we have a fail. So you can see here in the fail, it tells us line 22 in thickness value real. So it's looking for evaluating this real in millimeters, and it says it's an error in the decoding of a str or a string needs bytes like object int found. So let's go and take a look at this line 22 and see what we can do. So if we go back to our code, line 22 is this one here. So this thickness value that we passed it is the number 2. And we converted it to a string. And when we go to this expression, it's expecting a string. And what's happening here is that it's not getting the correct units for it to work. And what happened is this bracket here to convert it to a string should end right here. And what happened is I put the comma in and it ended up a little bit further down. And you'll notice the next line, 23, we didn't get to it, but it would throw an error also. So when you're typing these in, it is important that we make sure that our brackets are closed in the right spot. So let's go ahead and save it. Let's try it one more time. So back in Fusion, add-ins, create draft template, success. Now, fingers crossed, we've done everything. We've done all our homework. We know that we've passed it through the units manager, through the evaluate expression. We should see the right numbers. And now you can see here, draft, degree, 2, wall thickness, 2, internal wall thickness, 1.2. So everything here works. Let's go ahead and let's look back at the code and just sort of decompress what we've learned. So I'm going to get rid of all this stuff now that I know it works. I'm going to get rid of this extra space in here just to clean up the code a little bit. So if we take a look at what we've done, we did not include any user inputs, but you certainly could, just like we did before, you could have some of these as the defaults, the default name and the default value. You could pass them in a user input box and ask the user for a draft angle. Remember that we are dealing with degrees and you want to specifically call that out because we're manually handling that. Now, unlike using the evaluate expression for the default units, so instead of using millimeters here, for example, we could use the units manager and we could do default length units and that would be fine. And we could do the same thing here. We could use the units manager and the default length units because those default length units are millimeters and that's fine. But that doesn't really work with the degrees. So we do need to be mindful of that. We could also do it down here instead of manually putting millimeters. We can just bring this little bit of code here and we can replace the millimeters here. And this is kind of helpful because what this means is if the user happens to change it to inches, then it'll use those default values. But it gets a little tricky because we're inputting a metric value and then it's converting it and so on. So you need to be careful with these and you need to be very mindful of what you're asking for and what you're inputting. But what we have here is we've got a list of a bunch of variables. We're passing some as numbers, we're passing some as strings, and we're using these as the name for our user parameters, draft, wall thickness, internal wall thickness. From here, we're calling a variable, we're creating a variable to access the unit manager property. So we're taking our design variable, which up here is accessing our design class, and we're calling the units manager. So from here, we can get access to things like evaluate expression, which is going to take the values in the internal units, which again is radians for angles and centimeters for length values that we're dealing with. And then it's going to evaluate it. It's going to take it and make sure that it converts it depending on the units that we give it. So we're saying here we're passing you radians, we want it as degrees. Here we're passing you centimeters, but we want it as millimeters. So that means that the value that we're getting out of it here is going to be in the correct the correct expression. It's going to be the correct value that we pass back. So if we give 10 millimeters, we are not going to get a centimeter value back out of it in Fusion 360. We'll get the actual millimeter value like we want. This is coming back as a float, and that float needs to then be sent through create by real. And the create by real will format this value input into what our user parameters.add actually needs. So at any step in this process, what we could do is we could ask the user. We could use our UI message box or UI input box, and we could give them the available option to change these. However, this process is relatively quick and painless. So if we have a new design and we want to simply bring in all of these values, all we need to do is run that script, and then we already have these values in our parameters. From here, we can manually change this. Let's say we wanted 5 degrees, a wall thickness of 5 millimeters, and then we wanted this to be our wall thickness times 0.6. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to just build out this parameter list quickly, and then we can manually change them here or we could ask the user for input while the script is running. Either of those options would be fine. It's much easier to come back in here and tweak them. But you will note that this didn't automatically bring in that value, that expression that we created to take the wall thickness value and divide it or multiply it by something. So that didn't carry over because what we actually ended up doing was we passed that value. There are ways in which we could pass this expression directly into the user parameter. I haven't personally done that, but in the documentation, it does seem like it's possible. So it could be a way that we could do this. So if you want to maintain those, then you might need to do a little bit more work, but you can also come back in manually and do this. So this does save a bit of time, especially if you have a lot of parameters that you want to use or drive in your designs. It can be very helpful. But this was sort of a long and slow introduction to API in Fusion 360. Throughout all the videos so far, what we've done was we learned the basics of Python. And when I say we learned the basics, by no means did we learn all the basics. What we did was we learned the basics that we needed to work with Fusion API. So things like creating variables and assigning numbers or strings to them. We learned about creating classes, even though that's something that we haven't done in Fusion API. We learned about that because it was important, because that's how we access all of these objects. That's how we end up calling all of these functions. So we have things like, in this case, our units manager evaluate expression. That method was part of the collection that's inside of, in this case, our units manager, which are units managers part of design. Design is part of this Autodesk Fusion design class. So by learning the basics of creating those in Python, we learned the way in which we can access them in Fusion API. Then once we got into API, we learned the basics of using things like getting our user parameter using item by name. So if we already know that a parameter exists, we can find it by item by name or by item and getting the ID in our list. So with that, we're able to grab that information and we could print out the expression. Once we understood how we could do that, then we can use the user parameter add with the caveat that when we're passing that value, we need to use value input and create by real. So remember, all of this information came directly from the fact that when we use these methods, these functions that we're calling inside of the API, they tell us exactly what they're looking for: a string, value input, a string, and they tell us what we're getting back out of it. So with this, we can go into the help file, we can figure out more about what this value input really means. We can also look through here, it tells us exactly what it means. We can figure out how that works. When we're taking a look at using the user input itself is a little bit different, because the user input is not just giving us back a string or a float or some sort of true false statement. It's actually giving us back what they call a tuple. It's giving us back a string in the 0 position and a boolean, which is like a true false. So then we need to deal with that extra additive complexity, and we need to figure out how to pull the string out. And we do that by using the square brackets and the number 0, because the string is that first element inside of that tuple. So then we can use the user input, just like we did before. We evaluate the expression, we do the value input and create by real, and then we create a user parameter that way. So all of this, to this point, what we've been focusing on is the creation of a user parameter. However, the functionality, the path that we went down to do this, with all of these little micro programs to figure out the one thing that we needed to do to get to the next step, that's the process that I generally follow when I'm trying to learn to do these things. I figure out a little piece of the code that I need to progress down the next piece of the puzzle. Now, if you're an actual programmer, if you're somebody that programs and knows a lot more about object-oriented programming, about API, about Python in general, that's probably not the direction or the path that you go down, because you already understand a bit more about how to access these things. But if you're like me, trying to learn and you're trying to figure out the pieces as you go along, making these little pieces, making these little sections of code along the way will help build that puzzle. And the way that we did this, the process of this is going to be the same no matter what you're trying to do, right? So if we're looking for user input, or we're looking for creating a user parameter, or we're trying to figure out how to get the user to select something, the process of going through the help file and going down through the PDF and looking at the object model and figuring out that if we want to create a button or a checkbox or a list, those are all belonging to the command definitions, and the command definitions belong to the user interface. So you can sort of follow this hierarchy or this chain of command to figure out what you need to access in order to do these things. And also don't forget that in Fusion 360, there are a lot of sample add-ins and there are a lot of sample scripts. And when we go to the add-ins, for example, the command sample, when we run that, we've already seen and played with the fact that it puts a new toolbar or some new commands on the toolbar. And when we look in here, for example, at everything, we can see that it pops up a dialog. We've got some manipulators on screen. We can move things around and change orientation. We can rotate. We've got radio buttons. We've got string values where we can enter. We've got input values, different additional inputs and sliders. All of these different bits of information, you can go into the add-ins, you can go to the command sample, and you can edit. And when you edit this, what you want to do is you want to come into the command section. You want to find everything. You want to go into, and everything, go into entry. And you can see here there are drop-down list style, drop-down list input, items. We've got radio inputs. We've got selection inputs. You can see how all of this stuff is defined. And once you figure out how all of this stuff is defined, then you can go down and you can figure out how those items are created. So you can see here we have some comments. The function will be called when the user clicks the OK button. So going through this can help you figure out how to build some of those extra little pieces into your own code without having to go through the process of trying to learn everything a little piece at a time. So if you can find a bit of code in one of these samples, for example, basic, you can see basic is a dialog that has two things. It lets you enter text and it asks for a value. So we can find that information in the code and we can apply it to whatever we're doing. So that's one way that we can go about it. The other way, again, is the little bits and pieces where we sort of play around with what's available to us and we find the little bits and little pieces as we need them. So I think both of those are really good options, at least for myself. It helps me see code, but oftentimes the code that we find is going to be a little bit more complicated or potentially it goes a little bit deeper than we are ready for, which is why I like to build small pieces of the puzzle as we go. So at this stage, I think that it's probably as far as I'm going to take this. The intent here was to be able to have a script that could create a template. And of course, we can hard code in more values. As many as we want, we can hard code in here, or we can tweak it with the user input, however we need to get it to work. But at this stage, everything that I was attempting to achieve has been done just in this bit of code here. But if you have any questions on this, then please let me know. If you want to learn more, I'm happy to try to progress my own knowledge and try to convey it. But if there's a specific thing that you're trying to do, I'd love to hear that and maybe give some direction. Again, there's lots of sample code in the help file. That's a great place to start. There might already be a bit of code that does what you want to do. But this is my process. Hopefully it's been helpful. I'd love to hear some feedback on things that you're trying to make, or maybe potential areas where it doesn't quite make sense. Maybe something I said didn't make sense, or if I said anything incorrectly and you have more knowledge than I do in this, please let me know. I want to make sure that everything that I put out is correct. So as always, I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.